Everybody. Welcome to our June Plants, Pests, and Pathogens. My name's Charlotte Glen. I'm the state coordinator for the Extension Master Gardener program, and we're very glad to have you here. If you're new joining us today, Plants, Pests, and Pathogens is a continuing education webinar series for Master Gardener volunteers and extension agents. It's held monthly during the growing season, so from February through October, always on these fourth Tuesdays to get that right. And we generally talk about current horticultural issues as well as current pest and plant disease issues. We're always very fortunate to have our experts from the NC State Plant Disease and Insect Clinic, Matt Bertone and Mike Munster, to join us. And then also Caroline Richardson, who is a program assistant with the Extension Master Gardener program, plays a huge part in helping coordinate the webinars and getting everything running and getting everybody connected. So for today, I will start us off with a look at invasive plants. This is part of our feature topic for today, where we're looking at updates and what's coming up and coming out in invasive plants, pests, and pathogens across the state. After I talk about the plants, we have a recording from Matt Bertone, who's going to give us an update on some invasive pests and be on the lookout pests that are around this time of year. That's what the bolos are indicating, be on the lookout. And then Mike Munster will tell us about pathogens, or invasive pathogens that are in our area or that we need to be on the lookout for, as well as just our normal everyday garden variety plant pathogens that we can be on the lookout for at this time of year. Caroline Richardson will round us out with our resource spotlight and then some program announcements. So we encourage you to stay with us to the end to get those announcements. So talking about invasives, and we had a discussion, we had some email discussion back and forth between Caroline and Mike and Matt and myself in preparation for today's webinar about, the definition of invasives. And they're generally all alike, but there's a lot of different definitions out there. So we are using the National Invasive Species Information Center's definition, which is from USDA. That invasives are plants, animals, or pathogens that are not native to the ecosystem under consideration. So, that's a really important thing, that invasives are site-specific or location-specific. So something that naturally occurs in an area would not be invasive in that area because it is native or naturally occurs there. But when it gets introduced in another area and just kind of runs rampant, that's when it's considered invasive. So very important part of the definition is that it's not native to the ecosystem where it's been introduced. And the second extremely important part, and why we're so concerned, is that the introduction of these species causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So these are things that are bad for our environment. They could be harmful to people. They could be harmful to livestock or pets, or harm the economy in other ways. So today we're going to focus on some of the invasives relevant to North Carolina, some updates and some things to keep an eye out for. And you see in the picture I have here is of redweed. And this is thanks to Mike, as we were talking back and forth about invasives. He shared with us from the War of the Worlds that redweed was a plant brought to Earth by the Martians, and it took over. So I wasn't as familiar with the War of the Worlds with redweed that was introduced there, but some pretty interesting illustrations online, and you could see if this was real, it would be a pretty bad thing, a weed that was able to take over and cover everything, which kind of makes you think of some of our invasive weeds such as kudzu. So we are going to jump in and talk about invasive plants specifically to start off with. And invasive plants share some characteristics, and that's what makes them invasive. So they tend to be, of course, adaptable to the region where they've been introduced, and that allows them to just take off and grow really well. A lot of times the region where they're introduced is very similar to where they are native. That's why we see a lot of the invasives in our area may have common names that start with Chinese or Japanese, because um, Asia has very similar climates to we have here in Eastern North America. So a lot of those plants are able to adapt very well here. Also, they're able to use our local pollinators, especially for things that are spreading by seed and need pollination. So they don't have to overcome some kind of need for pollinators to get them going and spreading to produce viable seed. They will typically reproduce and spread rapidly by roots or seeds. Often by seeds are going to be the ones that spread quickly because they can jump further. Although those that do spread by roots, especially anytime we are moving soil or moving things around that could have root pieces in it or seeds in it, we could potentially be moving these invasive plants. Many of them that spread by seed are going to produce lots of seed, lots of fruit, and they germinate quickly, they come up quickly, grow and establish very quickly. So they typically outgrow the plants that are native to that area and just kind of smother them out over time. Especially with our woody plants, we see that they have a dispersal method such as birds. So they'll produce berries that attract birds, the birds eat them, and then they help spread them. And that gets them, really spread across the landscape. And I think a great example of that is the autumn olive, which is a type of Elaeagnus, very common in the Piedmont, but it can be found across the state. And there are other species of Elaeagnus that are also invasive. They all produce these fruits that are highly attractive to birds. And one of the reasons is because they're really high in sugar. And they are like junk food for birds. They will favor eating these Elaeagnus fruit over more nutritious native fruit, such as dogwood. And then they start trying to migrate. And because this is just really sugar in these autumn olive fruits, there's no protein or some of the other more complex calorie sources that we find in some of our native fruits, then they run out of energy in their migration. So not only do the fruits attract the birds who then help spread the invasive plant, but it's just bad for the birds. And like us, they're going to prefer these fruits because they taste really good and they're nice and sweet. So these are things we don't want to have in our environment. And then last of all, they tend to lack natural predators. So that means nothing's controlling their spread, whereas usually where they did originate, they had natural predators such as insects or even diseases that help keep them under control. But they come to this new environment. Our stuff doesn't really, our insects are like, what's this? This doesn't taste good. It's not what we're used to eating. They tend to leave it alone. And so they get to spread unimpeded. And of course, one of the worst things with invasive species when they are really at their worst is they threaten biodiversity. When they can come in and grow faster and replace the plants that naturally would have occurred in an area, they disrupt those habitats that are needed. Biodiversity is just the variety of living things that are naturally occurring around us. And all of this biodiversity is really important to supporting life on Earth through providing what are called ecosystem services. And this includes air and water purification, nutrient cycling, things like climate moderation, and pollination is a really important one. We as gardeners often think a lot about erosion and flood control. Some of these any plants can provide, but definitely when we have greater biodiversity, we have better ecosystem services and more resilient ecosystem services. And some of them, such as pollination, are particularly sensitive to the types of plants that are in a region. And invasive species are one of the greatest threats to biodiversity throughout the world. So it is a serious topic that gets a lot of attention and a lot of effort, goes into monitoring for invasive species and controlling them, trying to prevent them from getting into areas. Most of the focus is on prevention of introducing new things. Once something's here and widespread, just because of the limited resources there are for doing a lot of this type of preventative work and control work, if it's here and widespread, there aren't a lot of resources going to try to control it. Those focus more on stopping the introduction of new things. So I think, the classic example, as already mentioned, is kudzu. When at their worst, the invasive plants can just destroy ecosystem function. And you've probably seen scenes like this throughout the South where kudzu came in and literally covered everything and killed everything underneath. So now what used to be a variety of different trees and understory plants that probably supported many different types of pollinators and birds, now it's just kudzu, which primarily supports kudzu bugs, which are not something we want either, because they are also a non-native species. And when we talk about invasive plants, really any type of plant can be invasive. There are invasive plants that are annuals, such as Japanese stiltgrass. It's less common to see perennials, or we have less invasive plants that are herbaceous perennials. And I think that's just down to the nature of perennials themselves. Tend to not be as prolific seed producers, and they're a little slower to get established compared to annuals. Annuals, their whole way of life is just live fast and die young, throw tons of seeds out there, and just get going as quickly as you can. So they're nature made to just take over areas. But we do have definitely some herbaceous perennials, such as Johnson grass. Then there are the woody invasive plants. We have quite a few. Again, trees, if you look at the numbers of the categories, we have less trees that are invasive species, but one that we hear a lot about is Bradford pear. In March, when they're blooming, you definitely can see how much they're spreading from where they were planted in landscapes. And initially, that was not thought to be considered an issue. They were not going to set fertile fruit. But as other varieties were introduced and cross-pollination was able to occur, we started to see Bradford pears producing very fertile fruit that gets spread by the birds. And so now we have a situation where the offspring, which definitely produce viable fruit, are reproducing and spreading rapidly. So much so that the program's been established, the North Carolina Bradford Pear Bounty, you may have heard about, where different organizations are working together, and Extension's been hosting some of these events where you can prove you've removed your Bradford pear in your landscape, and you get some native tree seedlings or young trees to replace them with. Then, of course, shrubs. Many of our invasive plants, especially in the woodland areas, are shrubs or vines, woody vines and woody shrubs, things like Chinese privet, and of course, the autumn olive we were mentioning before. With vines, they're especially well adapted because they can climb up other trees, they can climb up larger plants, always to get to the sunlight, and they can potentially cover them and smother them. So an example that's actually blooming right now is Japanese honeysuckle, which of course is very fragrant. It smells wonderful, but not something we want in our natural areas because of its potential to overtake and overrun the native plants. And then some of the greatest or most prolific invasive plants, and in fact, where a lot of the resources are dedicated to preventing the introduction of, is in aquatic plants. Aquatic plants reproduce exceptionally rapidly. Some of them, like giant salvinia, in the summer can double their mass every day. So these have a lot of potential to cause tremendous economic and other and ecosystem harm to wetland areas, to waterways. So, there is a lot of focus on monitoring and potentially controlling these aquatic plants. Some of them just float on the surface of the water, like giant salvinia. Others have roots that go down into the soil beneath, such as creeping water primrose. And then there's quite a few that will have both. So they're both rooted and they can free float. They can do it both ways, so they're very adaptable. An example of that is hydrilla. So these slides will be available for you to review, and when you go, you can click on any of the links and learn more about these specific examples. I wanted to throw out, as gardeners, we often use the term invasive to talk about plants that are in reality weedy. So, we might say something that seeds and comes up everywhere is invasive, or particularly something that spreads by roots, things like mint and bee balm and these plants that produce long stolons and just pop up everywhere in your garden, and then it's very difficult to get rid of them. So from a gardener's perspective, we may describe those invasive, but today in our discussion about invasive species, we're really using that as an ecological term. So we're going to restrict invasive for those plants that are not native to an area, but they spread into natural areas and displace the natural species that occur there. They reduce biodiversity, and again, they could cause this economic, ecosystem, and potential human health harm. Whereas weeds and weedy plants is more of a gardener's and an agricultural term. And these plants, such as henbit, we see in the picture, an early spring weed in fields and lawns, they tend to mainly just stick to human maintained or human disturbed sites. So they don't go and then start showing up in undisturbed natural areas and displacing those native species. And one other term you may have run across is noxious weeds. So noxious weed specifically is a regulatory term, and a plant may be designated a noxious weed by the federal, state, or in some cases, county government. And so this allows resources to be focused on monitoring and controlling for that weed. For noxious weeds, there is a zero tolerance. So there are active programs in North Carolina that are run through the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services that are looking for these noxious weeds. And if they are found, they'll move in and aim for complete eradication. And there are also regulations about the movement of those plants. So if something is deemed a noxious weed, you can't sell it or move it or introduce it within the regulated area. You can see a list of noxious weeds on the NCDA website. Most of them are aquatic, and actually most of those are set at the federal level. And you probably won't recognize a whole lot of them because most of them, for one, aren't here because there are active programs to keep them out. But they really aren't things that have been grown as landscape plants. One exception being beech vitex, which you can see in the pictures, that was introduced for erosion control in the 1980s and was planted on dunes initially in South Carolina and has spread to North Carolina, and millions of dollars have been spent trying to eradicate beech vitex because it's actually not good for the dune ecosystem. So we're not going to do an extensive coverage of all the different invasive species today because there's a lot of resources out there that will help you learn about those, and Caroline will be highlighting a couple later in the presentation today. But we want to talk a little bit about what you can do and a group of plants to look out for and things that you can plant instead of those. So one of the most important things you can do is become familiar with the species that are invasive to your region. Whereas we do have this noxious weed list for North Carolina, there's not one kind of unified, everybody agrees on list of invasive plants for North Carolina, or there hasn't been a list of invasive plants put out by a regulatory agency. But there are a lot of resources, and there's a lot of consensus among these lists that you can consult. And again, you'll be able to come back to these slides and click on these links to investigate them more. But things like the Extension Gardener Plant Toolbox has an invasive tag built into it, so you can go in and explore the invasive plants that are in there, learn more about them, see pictures, get ID tips. The North Carolina Invasive Plant Council, which Caroline will be telling us more about, is a wonderful resource. Also, the North Carolina Native Plant Society has a list of invasive species, and theirs is interesting because they rank them by threat level. Which is a good way to think about invasive plants. Some of them are a higher threat than others because they just have greater potential to do more harm and do it more quickly. Also, the U.S. Forest Service, their list specifically focuses on things in forests. And then a couple of sites like the Invasive Plant Atlas, which is a partnership between USDA, National Park Service, and other agencies. And there is a site called EdMaps, which is out of the University of Georgia. And it tracks new and emerging invasive species. And we'll actually have a speaker later this year tell us more about EDMAPs and how you can contribute. So get to know the invasive species in your area, look and scout in your yard and on your property, and work to remove those plants. Sometimes you can do physical removal, but a lot of times, especially when we start talking about some of the woody species, just cutting them down is not enough, and it's often very difficult to pull them up if they're established. You could potentially dig them up, but you would need to remove the roots. And a lot of times with these woody species, you need to consider using a herbicide, and the Ag Chem Manual and other extension resources have some recommendations for that, and we'll include some of those links in the follow-up resources that come out with this recording. The other thing that's important with especially these woody invasives is you need to keep watch over the site even after you've pulled it up or removed a plant. There could be seedlings or root sprouts to emerge over the next couple of years. So you really want to make sure you stay on top of those and completely get rid of them. And as gardeners, a hugely important thing we can do is just be thoughtful about our plant selection. So we always talk about right plant, right place. We always talk about and think about, is this plant suited to the site conditions, the sun or the shade, the soil drainage, other challenges I might have like deer or slope. We think about things like, why are we putting this plant in the landscape? Do we need it to screen something? Are we looking for seasonal color? Are we looking for something that's low maintenance? But we need to also bring into this, in our considerations, this layer of environmental impacts, both good and bad. So more and more people are thinking when they choose a plant, is this good for pollinators? You know, do the flowers support native bees, support different pollinators? Do they have benefits for birds and other wildlife? And we want to add to that consideration the invasive potential. And again, that's where the plant toolbox is such a valuable tool, because it has all of this information readily available to you. So including whether something's considered invasive in North Carolina. So I encourage you to use the plant toolbox to research your plant choices and check out, you know, anything you're thinking about adding in your landscape. So with our thoughtful plant selection, you know, when you are choosing a new plant for your landscape, you know, we encourage you to favor either plants that are native to your region, or if they are non-native, they don't have a known threat, invasive potential. So some things, you know, again, going back and consulting and reading through the list from the different organizations on our previous slide will help you become familiar with things that maybe we're still planting commonly in our landscapes. In fact, the picture on the previous slide, the Japanese privet, Ligustrum japonicum, has potential to become invasive. Its cousin, the Chinese privet, is one of our worst and most widespread invasive plants throughout forests and low wetland areas across the state and the southeast. So a lot of times that close relationship can be an indication that a plant, if it has another closely related plant that's become invasive, there's more potential for it to become invasive. It can sometimes take time for plants to become invasive in a region after they're introduced. Chinese privet, again, is a good example that when it first was planted, for many years, we didn't see it self-seeding, and then it just clicked. So whether it was pollinators or what aligned, it was able to overcome whatever was preventing it from self-seeding throughout our region, and now it can be found pretty much everywhere. And then a lot of times there is a discussion, you know, well, so should we only do natives? And, you know, we're not saying that, of course, all non-native plants are not going to be invasive. It's actually a very, very small percent of them, maybe around, I think around 3% I've seen cited in literature. So most of our exotic or non-native plants are going to be fine. But when you are in a particularly sensitive area, say if you live adjacent to a natural area, especially a nature preserve or woodland areas, That's when you want to be especially thoughtful, because if you are directly adjacent to a natural area or a nature preserve and you put something in that has some potential to be invasive, you've just set the fox among the hen house. You've put it very close, and just increased its potential to move into that natural area, and reduced barriers, like time and distance. So when you are planting and selecting plants close to these type of natural areas, it would be preferable to go with native plants, or especially to do extremely careful research, and avoid anything that has the potential to be invasive. So we're going to talk about a specific group of plants. Again, back to the idea of removing plants that are known to be invasive from your property. And this is going to harken a little bit back to our Plant These Instead series from our last 2 seasons. And this is, Caroline and I chose this group of plants, the barberry family, or Berberidaceae, because they're not something we've covered before. So they weren't in our Plant These Instead archive. And they are a group of plants that we're seeing become more invasive. And when we look further south, say to Alabama and Georgia, these plants are spreading pretty rapidly. And that's always a good indication. Is something likely to become invasive for us? Look a little bit further south, and if it's spreading there, then we're likely to see it spread for us, rather than looking north. There's not generally as much correlation going north as there is going south. So the barberry family, I have seen more Nandina, especially, popping up. Usually the edge of the woods, edges, but occasionally a little bit in. So, they're slowly moving, and the concern is they're going to reach a critical kind of tipping point, and then the spread could become more rapid just because they are more widespread. So things in this barberry family include Nandina, which is a really common, kind of one of these old-fashioned shrubs, a pass-along shrub, because you can dig up a piece and give it to somebody and they can plant it. It has those brilliant red berries in the winter. Its relatives, the leatherleaf mahonia, which used to be a mahonia, used to be the genus, but now is actually categorized as a barberry, Barbaris. And then the barberry itself, particularly the species Barbaris thunbergii. And these are concerned because they all produce berries that attract birds. And so they have that potential to spread pretty rapidly. And what we really want to encourage you to do, if you have these plants in your landscape or in demonstration gardens at the Extension office, is to remove them. And if that's not something you can do right away, especially because it's going to be 100 degrees next week, at a minimum, remove the flowers or remove the immature fruit, to prevent them from producing berries that could be spread. That's a lot more realistic with Nandina and Mahonia, because they produce those flowers and fruits in clusters at the top of the plant, so it's pretty easy to cut them out. It would be extremely difficult with barberry, as you see in the lower picture, because the flowers and the fruits are all along the stem throughout the plant. So that's a practical consideration. So we're going to look at each one of these and a couple of alternatives, and then we will hear our recording from Matt Bertone. So starting first with Nandina, and this is Nandina domestica, sometimes called heavenly bamboo, and it is an upright evergreen shrub. And one thing that's fairly unique about it is the very lacy texture of the leaves, and that's because they are divided 2 or 3 times. So that's known as bipinnate or tripinnate compound leaves. And you can see in the lower picture some of those, the division of those multiple divisions of the leaflets. It's very adaptable to grow in sun or shade, and that allows it to establish in woodland areas. And other than the foliage, it's often typically grown for the berries, which are very striking, but they do attract the birds. And actually, in areas where there's not other food sources, where there's a lot of Nandina and there's not a lot of native plants that have berries available to birds, it's been found that birds will, particularly cedar waxwings, will just eat these Nandina berries, which contain cyanide, and it has caused death of the birds by cyanide toxicity. There's a link here to a study in Georgia that looked at this. So when you get a large concentration of Nandina without other healthier food choices for birds, particularly the cedar waxwings, it can cause them to die due to cyanide toxicity. And they are also poisonous to people, so don't eat the berries. So if you're looking for something else to plant instead of the heavenly bamboo, the more old-fashioned type of Nandina, there are newer varieties that are sterile. Extremely reliably sterile are these very dwarf, wider leaf. So you don't quite get the same texture. These wide leaf varieties, such as Firepower, which we see pictured here. There's another one named Pink Blush, which is similar. And there's a few other out there. I think there's one named Woods Dwarf. But these ones, they all have this look where the leaflets are much wider than the old-fashioned one. You can see where they're narrower and have a finer texture. These don't bloom at all. They don't produce any berries. In the summer, they tend to have this kind of lime green color, and in the winter, they can turn quite striking crimson colors. So this one is especially if you need something short, this is a very reliable one that there's no concern about it producing berries and being invasive. There are also some newer dwarf varieties that have been introduced that are reported to be sterile. So, I say reported to be sterile because they haven't been on the market or in the landscape terribly long, and it may be with enough age they could produce flowers. There are some older varieties of these narrow leaf dwarf ones. There's one named Harbor Dwarf that with enough age, it will produce some flowers and a few berries. They're not going to produce, it doesn't produce nearly as many as the old-fashioned one. And I think if these dwarf ones ever did get to the point they flowered or fruited, it would be very limited. But I wouldn't be comfortable saying absolutely 100% these are totally sterile at this point. And at some point in the future, that may be something we're all comfortable with saying. So these include varieties like Flirt, which is a shorter one, Lemon Lime, which has the more yellowy leaves, and Obsession. So I'd say I would, plant these in areas and just kind of keep an eye on them. Make sure you're not ever, seeing any flowers being produced from them. But they are reported to be sterile and non-blooming. If you do want to go for colorful berries, think about things like American Beautyberry, Calicarpa, which literally translates to beautiful fruit, Calicarpa americana, our American or our native beautyberry. This is one that occurs throughout eastern North Carolina and to the eastern part of the Piedmont and the southeastern United States. Has some of the most amazing berry color that I've ever come across on a shrub. Prior to the berries being formed and coloring in kind of late summer, early fall, it will have little tiny flowers in clusters, just like the berries are. And they attract some of our smaller pollinators. So it can be really interesting to go and they may even be blooming now and see what kind of pollinators are visiting. This is a shrub just typically for tidiness. It's cut back in the winter to about, a foot or 2 feet tall and let it grow out each year. But you do need to be careful because there are other species of Calicarpa. There are non-native species. They're from Asia, Calicarpa japonica and Calicarpa dichotoma. And I have seen them often confused for the native beautyberry. They tend to be a little smaller. The leaves are smaller, the whole plant smaller. But they have shown some potential to be invasive, again, in those states a little south to us. So I would expect that potential to be here as well. And another native with amazing berries is the possum haw viburnum nudum. Particularly some of the cultivars like Winterthur and Brandywine have been selected for their fruit color, and also they have amazing foliage color. They are deciduous, same as the Calicarpa, but they will give you great berry color starting in late summer and through the fall, and then really nice foliage color even into December often. So this is one that is quite an adaptable shrub, but if you're looking for something for wetter areas, it will tolerate flooding and is sometimes used in rain gardens or at the edges of wetland areas. The flowers come out in the spring, and then the berries, which again provide a great resource for songbirds. And then last of all, if you want berries, why not go with blueberries? They actually can make quite a nice landscape shrub, and you can get some edible fruit, although often the birds get more of the edible fruit than you do unless you take measures to barricade them from the birds. But they just in general are nice landscape plants, and we actually have over 17 species of vaccinium native to North Carolina. And some of them stay short, some of them get really tall. The ones we typically grow for fruit production in home gardens are called the rabbit eye blueberries, and they are ripening right now. This is actually a picture from my yard. And if you are going to try to plant them for fruit, definitely be sure to get a couple of different varieties so you have cross-pollination, and look for those varieties that were produced for our region and our winter temperatures, so they get enough cold chilling hours to set blooms. So there's some more great information available from Cooperative Extension if you're interested in growing blueberries for fruit. But I definitely encourage you to think of them also just as a nice landscape plant. So next we'll look at the leatherleaf mahonia, which again, in that barberry family. I don't have close-up pictures of the flowers because you might think of these plants, Nandina mahonia, and then particularly the barberry itself, and it's like, they just don't look like they'd be related. But if you look up at close-up images of the flowers, you can see that relationship. They have very similar flower structures. And in how plants are grouped, it is about their reproduction, and so the flower structure itself can often show more to you, reveal more to you than maybe the leaf arrangement or other things about the plant. So leatherleaf mahonia, sometimes called Oregon grape or Oregon grape holly. Again, it's got these pinnately compound leaves, so they're divided. It's got quite a unique texture. It's a prickly plant. It is upright and evergreen. It is, I think, one of its biggest points of why it started to be used in landscapes is just it will tolerate those dry, shady areas where almost nothing else grows. And that allows it to establish in woodland areas. In fact, this is a picture of one I found quite deep in the woods. It surprised me a lot to find it back there. And it was kind of a colony. You'll see this is the main plant, but there were several other plants kind of all around it, which I don't know if they were root suckers or seedlings, but it was definitely getting a good hold there. And the top picture shows those berries, which the birds love, that are ripening now, most likely if they haven't already ripened. So if you have this plant in your landscape, you want to go out and check it. And if there's berries on it, just please cut them off. And consider replacing it with something along the lines of one of the shrubs we're looking at here. So these are some non-native, but very shade tolerant, upright, evergreen shrubs, things like Clayura, which is extremely tough and has become very popular because it also has proven to be quite deer resistant, which mahonia is as well. And a newer introduction are some of these distiliums. These are in the same family as loropetalum and witch hazel. So I think it's going to be really interesting. They're being promoted kind of like loropetalum was when it was first introduced. It's really tough, adaptable, grow anywhere. But I'm wondering if they're going to do better in those shadier locations where you've got the soils a little more moisture retentive. But this one variety, particularly linebacker, is a more upright one, where some of the others are low spreading types of shrubs. This one goes more upright, kind of a very similar shape to Clayura. And the new growth can take on these nice pinkish and reddish tints. And if you're looking for natives, the wrong picture showing up here, sorry. I don't know. Oh no, I'm sorry, that is the correct picture. Confused myself for a minute. But if you're looking specifically for natives, a couple of options include the Florida anise tree, which Alyssium floridanum is from a little further south, doesn't actually occur in North Carolina, but I think from South Carolina down through Florida. It does prefer moister soils, and it does need to be acidic, but it is very shade tolerant and will have these really unique looking flowers in the spring. And then something a little more sun tolerant would be inkberry, the Ilex glaber, which is a type of holly. This one in the picture is shamrock, and it's kind of looks a little bit like a holly, well, a holly, which is in that family, but also boxwood. And it's being promoted as a alternative for boxwood due to some of the disease issues boxwood's having. So a new one that's been introduced is named Strong Box. I actually saw it at one of the big box stores this past weekend, and it's a compact one, so you might see that one at some of the nurseries and garden centers. But it is called inkberry because the female plants will have these very dark colored berries in the late summer and fall. And I believe most of the varieties that are out there are female. And like other hollies, though, you'd have to have a male somewhere in the vicinity to pollinate it to get the berries. All right, finishing up with barberry, Barberus thunbergii. This one I think is sometimes referred to as Japanese barberry. And it doesn't have the same bipinnate leaves as its cousins. It just has these simple leaves, but it tends to have very colorful foliage, or the varieties that we plant in landscapes either have purple, or they can have gold or yellow, or sometimes pretty outrageously variegated. There's a variety, I think, that's got a purple leaf with a gold edge. You can see this one has a purpley pink leaf with some white variegation splashing in. So the foliage is the thing we go for with this, but it is deciduous. It loses the leaves in the winter. They tend to be kind of medium-sized shrubs with, this more natural growth pattern. But the bad thing is all of the berries they produce, so those could be spread by birds and potentially lead to it spreading into natural areas. So if you have barberry and you want to replace it, some options, and especially you're looking for foliage color, some options would include Fothergilla, particularly this variety Mount Airy, which is a selection of the species Fothergilla latifolia, native to the Southeast, and in North Carolina we find it in the Piedmont and the mountains. But this grows also well in our coastal plain. And it has particularly brilliant fall color and quite reliable fall color, even in the coastal areas. So this would be something that would especially give you nice fall color. You could have some blooms in the spring that attract pollinators, and just a very tough shrub, which again, another one that's proven to be very deer resistant, and it's become popular because of that. And last of all, a species of viburnum, which doesn't have a lot of common names because it's not so far a very commonly grown viburnum, the Viburnum obovatum. More likely they're often referred to by their cultivar name. So this one is Ralston's hardy, which is a dwarf variety. And you can see in the pictures, it looks quite a bit like dwarf yaupon. And but it will have these white flowers similar to many of our native viburnums. Potential to produce berries, but usually with these viburnums, you'd need multiple varieties to get cross-pollination. So this one is actually at my house, but I've never had it produce berries. So this would be an option. Keep in mind, it's only hardy to zone 7A, and in very cold winters, it can defoliate. And I've had that happen once or twice, but it has always come back. So you can investigate more plants from the Plant These Instead archive, and we will have this link as in our follow-up resources, as well as posted with the recording. So I encourage you to look up more plants, and we're going to keep moving forward and talk about invasive arthropod pests and bolos. And we have a recording from Matt Bertone, who wasn't able to join us live, but we really appreciate him preparing this recording to let us know about invasive insects.
Excuse me, Charlotte.
Yes.
We just wanted to, at this point, we wanted to remind everybody, this would be a good time to turn up your volume. Turn up the volume on your computer or on your headphones. Turn it up nice and loud. Matt's recording is coming through just fine, but I noticed when we practiced, it really helped if I turned up my volume. So go ahead and do that now, which will give you a second to find that. And here we go.
Thanks so much, Carolyn.
Hi, everyone. Sorry I can't be here in person this morning, but I've pre-recorded this so that I could tell you all about some invasive arthropods and basically update you on them in relation to North Carolina. The first, I'm going to start off with the one that's on everybody's minds, the spotted lanternfly. So this is a plant hopper, a large plant hopper that has been in the news a lot. It was first found in Pennsylvania about 2016 or so, but has been spreading throughout the eastern part of the Atlantic states, and it's now established a breeding population in North Carolina. This can be found in Forsyth and Guilford County. And that was first discovered last year, June 2022. But they think because the population was established that it's been there for at least a couple years. Now, it's not established anywhere else in the state that we know of yet, but we are on the lookout for it in other parts of the state. This is an insect that feeds on plants. It sucks on sap from the plants, from the phloem. And because of that, it can produce lots of honeydew. It's not harmful to humans or pets, so it doesn't bite or sting or anything like that. But the biggest threats are really just the nuisance, the presence of hundreds or thousands of them, sometimes on trees and in yards, sometimes getting into homes and buildings. And also the amount of honeydew they produce can cause a lot of sooty mold growth on objects nearby. Now, they do have some information that spotted lanternfly can affect grapes. Large numbers can actually stunt and kill the grapes. And so this is the crop that people are most worried about, but otherwise they don't seem to be a huge pest, direct pest of trees and other plants. And they do feed on lots of different plants, although tree of heaven, a weed itself, is the preferred host for this insect, both of which come from Asia. Now, here's the current distribution of spotted lanternfly in the U.S. The blue counties are the ones where infestations are present, and the little purple dots are where specimens have been found, but they're isolated and there are no infestations yet. You can see in North Carolina, there's the two counties, Forsyth and Guilford counties. And they basically have been restricted to a few mile radius around Kernersville, North Carolina, so right on the border of these two counties. But of course, we are on the lookout for any others in the state, or people in other states are looking out for them as well, because they are going to become such a big nuisance. And once they cross the state and get very common around the state, a lot of people are going to be seeing them because they become very abundant in yards and natural areas. Just looking at some of the life cycle, and I'll show some photos of this more in a second. But they have one generation per year. The egg masses are actually laid on trees and other objects, and basically are covered in this mud-like coating, and these little barrel-shaped eggs are found inside. I took this photo actually in Delaware, where the infestation is present. So the egg masses, the eggs hatch, and they go through 4 instars. The early instars are black with white dots, and the later instars are red. And the adults are these moth-like creatures with these beautiful spotted wings and these red hind wings, or at least partially red hind wings. Now, here in North Carolina, the egg masses are basically the overwintering stage. And then in late March to June, although apparently this year we saw them in about early March, the first instars emerging and feeding on herbaceous plants. And as they get bigger, they move to woody plants, change color, and then the adults develop, and then they will mate, lay eggs on objects, die, and that'll complete the life cycle. Now, what to do about them? First thing is to stay calm. If you find them in an area that's not reported in a reported area, notify NCDA. Many home pyrethroid sprays will kill them on contact, but also crushing them or drowning them in soapy water can kill them. Scraping egg masses off the trees and other objects can take those out of the population. And really, these actions will at least remove some of the individuals from the population, but basically at this point, eradication is not possible. So they are going to be here to stay, unfortunately. Okay, now moving on to the next one. The next thing we found was last year was the elm zigzag sawfly. So this is a sawfly or a wasp in the family Argidae. It's native to East Asia, but it was established in Europe recently and then found in Canada in 2020. In North Carolina, it was found in August of 2022 in Surrey and Stokes County, but it's likely more widespread. And in fact, we have a paper coming out describing all of the populations that are currently found in the US, which include many of the eastern states down to here, North Carolina. They do feed only on elms, as their name implies, so species in the genus Ulmus. And the young larvae create a zigzag pattern, hence the name, and I'll show you that in a second. The older larvae actually feed a little bit more extensively on leaves, and it's an interesting insect in that only females are known. So they reproduce without mating, which means they can establish other places very easily. And once they emerge, they can lay eggs without having to mate, which makes them very easily to colonize areas and get started. Now, they have more than one generation per year, and it does vary. There's still we don't know exactly how many there are in North Carolina yet, but perhaps 2 to 4 generations per year, apparently up to 7 in captivity in lab rearing. Now, the zigzag design right here, you can see is made by the young instars, the first larvae that come out. And as they get older and larger, they will feed on more of the leaf. You can see here a lot more of the leaf is taken out. Now, the larvae can be told by these black T-shaped marks on their hind and middle legs. And they also have this black streak on their face as they get older. Now, of course, also these shouldn't be mistaken for caterpillars that would grow up into be moths. They do have more than 5 pairs of prolegs and also a single eye lens, which signifies that they're a sawfly. Now, after they're done feeding, they spin a cocoon. It can be very loose during the middle of the season and becomes more papery and thicker as they go into the overwintering cocoon stage. But from these cocoons will emerge a small black wasp with yellow legs. And these again can emerge and basically begin laying eggs almost immediately. And the eggs, because it's a sawfly refers to the ovipositor, the egg laying device that's saw-like, they actually can saw into the edges of leaves and lay these tiny bean-shaped eggs, which then again hatch and the larvae begin eating that zigzag pattern from the elms. Now, what to do about these? So defoliation can happen, but often the feeding damage is not extensive. We saw some defoliation in North Carolina, but in other states it hasn't been as severe. But even defoliation rarely harms the plant unless it happens year after year. So that's something to take into consideration. Now, pesticides have not been extensively tested, but common tree pest products should work. However, not BT. BT is for caterpillars, true caterpillars, not sawflies. I will also say that Dr. Kelly Oden, who has been working on this insect in the state in the forestry department, she says that trials are underway to look at the efficacy of certain pesticides on them. Now, in smaller trees, hand removal may work, but really we have yet to see their actual impact. So just bear that in mind if you find these insects on your elms. Okay, sorry to go through this quickly, but I want to make sure there's time for everyone else to talk. But the next pest, which we don't actually have here yet, is the box tree moth. This is a cramped moth. Again, not here yet, but be on the lookout, and that's why I want to warn everyone. So it is native to Asia, found in Europe later on. It was found in Ontario, Canada in 2018, and then in 2021 it was found in adjacent New York. And I believe there was a recent interception in Michigan as well. Now, the caterpillars feed on various boxwoods, Buxus species, which are also native to Asia and where they are found. It may attack other plants nearby when boxwood is gone, but I'm not sure whether that's the case here in North America. They may also feed on boxwood bark when the leaves are gone, so they can actually girdle the stems. These moths overwinter as larvae. They feed and pupate in the spring and complete the life cycle, and then they may have an additional generation after that. Now here's a very nice picture from Franziska Bauer, and showing kind of the different life stages of these moths. They lay small, flat clusters of eggs on leaves, on the underside surface of leaves, and out-hatch these green and black caterpillars that feed extensively on the plant. They'll pupate in silken kind of lattices in the plant material. And the moths are basically kind of have this dark border with a large white triangle and patch with these little commas. Although I should mention that that's not always the case, and you'll see that in a second. Now, what do they do? Here's a nice healthy boxwood, and on the right is what the caterpillars will do. They basically strip the plant of the leaves. They feed on the leaves. They may leave the little edges of the leaves and little bits here and there, leave a lot of silk, but utterly destroy the boxwood. So we are obviously very aware and very worried about this moth getting here. It's been devastating really old boxwoods in Europe, and is a major pest of boxwoods, obviously. Now, just quick note about identification. I showed you a picture of the light form, but there is also a dark form that only just has the little commas there, so be aware of that. And it should not be mixed up with some close relatives like the ones we have here, like the pickleworm or the melonworm. Melonworm is not very common in North Carolina. Pickleworm is much more common, and luckily it's a bit more distinct with these yellow kind of squiggly patches rather than the big white patches and the commas. Anyway, again, it's not here in North Carolina yet, but you know, early detections are really important, so be on the lookout for these on boxwoods. Okay, finally, I wanted to just give very lightning updates on a few other pests, or sorry, I shouldn't say pests, a few other arthropods and even other animals that are in the state and are not native, just so you all know about them. First, the Joro spider. So the Joro spider is a very large orb weaver that has only been in the US for a few years now. It was found in Georgia first, and there are records of it in North Carolina. It should not be confused with our native golden silk spiders, which are very common around the coast. And you can see the difference in colorations. They're smaller tufts on the legs on the Joro spider and whatnot. But we don't believe that they're going to be very harmful. They are not dangerous. They may look big and scary, but they're not going to hurt anyone. They're really kind of docile. They have a one generation per year. And so at this time of year, they're just getting a little bit bigger. And we really don't see the large females, which can be about the size of the palm of your hand, until late summer, early fall. And we have seen that in them in the state, even as far east as Durham. So they do tolerate a lot of different climates. And many of the records we have are from the western part of the state, where they're creeping up from around Atlanta, where they were first found. Anyway, don't freak out. These spiders are harmless. They are pretty impressive, and they're probably here to stay. Okay, the next group of organisms are the worms. So a lot of talk about jumping worms. I've heard a lot of people talking about them in their yards. These are a group of worms that are not native, but have been in North Carolina for many decades. They can be identified by their kind of taupe color, this flat saddle, this flat and saddle that encircles the entire body, and by rows of seedy ringing each segment. These are very destructive because they feed on the surface and feed on the litter and the top of the soil, and they will leave a lot of worm castings. Now, I am sorry I can't update you on new great control methods because there are none, unfortunately. But one thing you may do is if you catch them in the spring before the summer when they mature and lay their egg cocoons at the end of the year that will overwinter, the one thing you can do is remove as many out of the environment as possible by grabbing them, throwing them in a bucket of soapy water, drowning them, and then disposing of them, because that will remove any of the eggs that they might produce later on. Another group of worms that people are really talking about a lot still are the flatworms. We do have 11 species recorded from North Carolina, basically all not native. Many of them are these hammerhead type worms, but others are kind of a thinner one. We are not actively monitoring these worms, and they are not regulated. So really, there's nothing to be done if you find out that they're here. And many of them have been here for decades. A few of them are a little bit newer, only in the last 5 or 10 years. They're generally harmless in contrast to what news might say. And there's no need to destroy them unless you really want to. So again, they're out and about in North Carolina. They're, just because you notice them doesn't mean that they're doing something bad or that they're new. But if you do find one that does not appear on this list, I'll share the list with Caroline and Charlotte later so that you can see these. We would like to know, just to monitor new species that are coming in. But and it's best to keep the specimen and get good photos of the top and bottom. But otherwise, know that these species are already established in North Carolina, and really there's nothing that's going to be done about them. Okay, the Asian longhorn beetle is a very large longhorn beetle that's black and white. Right now there is still an infestation in a several mile radius around Charleston, South Carolina. So we are still monitoring in the state. We haven't detected it in the state yet, but be on the lookout for them. Again, large black beetles with little white spots. They're very large larvae that create very large holes. You can in fact stick a pencil in them. So if you find a maple, which is their preferred host, although they will feed on some other trees, if you find maple or any other hardwood that has these very large, very circular bore holes that are the size of a pencil in them, we should be on the lookout for that, and especially if you see any of the adults. But note that there are species around here that look similar, and so don't confuse the similar ones with the Asian longhorn beetle. The cottonwood borer has solidly colored antennae and much more extensive white on the body, and some of the pine sawyers are dark with little white specks on them, but the antennae are solid colored as well. So again, the Asian longhorn beetle has these black and white striped antennae. Okay, moving on quickly, the northern giant hornet, which was renamed from the Asian giant hornet, Vespa mandarinia. Well, I actually put a picture there, and we'll let you see what you think it is, but it is not in the state, and in fact, eradication efforts in the Pacific Northwest might be working, so we may actually eradicate it from the U.S. But I put a lot of information out on the extension portal, and I have this figure here that you all can reference to identify our 2 local large wasps, the European hornet shown here. That was not the northern giant hornet. It was kind of a trick. And the eastern cicada killer, which will be coming out soon enough. So be aware that we don't have it. We don't expect to have it. Most large wasps, all the large wasps here are going to be something else. Though if you do find something suspicious, we'd like to know. Okay, emerald ash borer. This is a wood-boring jewel beetle that only feeds on ashes, and it creates these serpentine galleries. The larvae do. The larvae have these bell-shaped segments and kind of this elongate body, and they do kill healthy trees. Now, there's not really much to be said about this because it is now very widespread in the U.S., at least the eastern half of the U.S. On the West Coast, they're really worried about it, but for now, honestly, it's here in North Carolina, it's widespread, and it's probably never going away. And so we're looking at management and resistant trees and some biocontrol, wasps, things like that, but really it's here in the state and it's here to stay. Finally, crepe myrtle bark scale. This small sucking insect only feeds on crepe myrtles, and it can create a lot of honeydew and cause city mold on these plants. There are also crepe myrtle aphids that will do that as well. But if you see lots of these little cottony looking structures on up and down the bark of crepe myrtles, and you have these little pinkish red insects inside, they'll look a little spiky, then you have crepe myrtle bark scale. Now, there are some control measures for it out there, and we can get you that information if you'd like. But for right now, we expect it to be across most of the state and kind of pretty widespread. And there's really no, again, eradicating this pest. It is going to be here to stay. And you can see it is across the state from the kind of western part to even the coast. Okay, that's all I have to say about some invasive arthropod updates.
All right, so that was lots of great stuff to think about. We're going to pause at this point, and Matt does also talk about a few be on the lookout pests, just pests that are normally around at this time of the year, but we've got a lot of great information to cover today, so we will be sure to include that part of the recording in the follow-up email that you will all get with the resources from today's presentation, because we want to make sure that we are able to fit everything in. And okay, excuse me, one minute, let me get to the next slide. And now we want to move on to Mike Munster, who is going to tell us about invasive plant pathogens and pathogens to be out on the lookout for this time of the year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so he can share, and we will find out about pathogens in our area, both invasive and garden variety.
Thank you, Charlotte. And thank you for following up on my reference to War of the Worlds there and looking up that really eerie painting there of the red weed. There was also the red creeper. As it turns out, there were two plants that the Martians introduced. And when I remember reading the book as a kid, I remember that he posited that one was wiped out by disease and the other one you could still find occasionally here and there. So I don't know if you should be on the lookout for that, but
maybe it's Campsis, trumpet creeper.
Who knows? Red enough, yes. Let's see here. I'm going to share a little about invasive plant pathogens, following the term that we're using here, although often in pathology, we talk about emerging plant diseases. So you could have something that would be technically emerging, but not invasive, because it would be either increasing in its incidence or geographic range, even though it might not be non-native. So, but invasive here, we're sticking with the definition that Charlotte presented at the beginning, that it's from or not native to the ecosystem under consideration, and that it causes or likely to cause economic or environmental harm. And I want to focus my attention on three of those, which are sudden oak death and remorum blight. That's one thing, and I'll explain why that's the case. Vascular streak dieback and beech leaf disease. As it turns out, those second and third diseases there are ones that we, or I anyway, had kind of debated, when the right moment was going to be to actually present this to the PPP audience, and well, today's the day. At the very end, I'll just make a real quick mention of three others that you may have heard about: laurel wilt, thousand cankers disease of walnut, and tomato brown rugose fruit virus. So these are these invasives, these ones that, well, they're the swords of Damocles hanging over our happy diagnostic lives. So here in the clinic, we have to kind of be on the lookout for these things in a special way. Maybe less so in the home environment and setting, but we'll talk. Starting then with sudden oak death and remorum blight. And these are grouped together here under what we could call Phytophthora remorum diseases. Phytophthora remorum being a particular species of this fungus-like organism. And the phrase sudden oak death refers to how it manifests on oak and tan oak, particularly in the oaks, the red oak group. This has done a lot of damage out in California, causes trunk cankers that may have a kind of a dark or reddish exudation there, kind of a bleeding canker look that can eventually lead to the death of these trees. It's not really always sudden though. So you may have a tree that appears to die very quickly, but it's estimated, I was reading on the I think what's the California Sudden Oak Death Task Force. I'll get you that email in a moment, that web page. But it's estimated that 2 years or over 2 years are needed between infection and death. Here, and where does this occur? It was as Southern Oak Death first emerged in the 1980s in California, but then it took until maybe 1995 when they actually were able to pin down the cause or the report of it. And the origins appear to be in Asia. I saw one paper that talked about Vietnam and Japan. I'm not sure how to, they're not really close how that works. But oddly enough, it appears that it have been introduced multiple times into North America. And we have a couple of lineages here. There are 2 North American lineages, and there's also a European lineage that is in North America. So this is where Southern Oak Death per se has occurred. The green counties there highlight on the map. I wouldn't make too much out of the really eastern extent of Fresno County there. I think they just had to color the whole county in, but I seriously doubt it's in the Central Valley there. It's more of a coastal phenomenon, or it is a coastal phenomenon. Unfortunately, the models, well, first I should say it's established on this part of the Pacific coast and subject to federal quarantine. The big concern is that if this ever established in eastern forests, it would be a serious problem for our oaks, our red oaks in particular. And you have to think about a combination of things that would have to line up for that to happen. We'd have to have the right climate that it could survive. You'd have to have the right tree species that it would seriously affect. And then you have to have the right spreader species in that same ecosystem, which I'll talk about that in a minute. It appears though that those things would line up in our Southern Appalachians. So that is one of the areas that's of concern if this were ever to get into the eastern US. In spite of the fact that it's under federal quarantine, it has been distributed multiple times across the US on infected nursery stocks coming out of these areas where the disease occurs, where the pathogen occurs. So here is one example of a map showing what are called trace forwards. And these usually happen pretty quietly. So even here in the clinic, we're often not aware that they're going on. And in this particular case, we're talking about trace forwards for the pathogen Phytophthora ramorum. Went out of nurseries, they looked, all these dots here are places where a location received shipment of plants from the nurseries that were affected by the disease. Out of all those dots in those 3 years, 9 of them, the ones that are stars, I'm not sure if you can see it on your screen there, were sites where they found the pathogen Phytophthora ramorum and that they were eradicated. Now, if you look at the NCDA website, you'll see the disease was detected at one North Carolina nursery dealer in 2008, and there again in subsequent years, despite eradication efforts and the application of other federally mandated protocols. And then monitoring continued after that. I don't have a current update on the status of that situation, but I can say that we do not have sudden oak death as a disease in North Carolina. Whether the pathogen may be lurking there in that particular spot, I can't really say at this point. So why this worry about distribution in nursery stock? Is it oaks that are being spread around? That's not the concern. It turns out that the same pathogen causes something that we call ramorum blight. And that occurs on shrubs, things that will be an understory in the native environment, especially rhododendron, pieris, camellia, kalmia, and viburnum. I don't know if there may be another one because they talked about the dirty half dozen, but these would be big ones. And many, many other different species where this can occur. Unfortunately, though, it only is causing maybe a leaf spot, a leaf blotch, twig dieback, that sort of more subtle symptom that that you could overlook easily. But these are the hosts where the pathogen reproduces. So it's reproducing on these shrubs, but then when it infects the oaks and tan oaks, that's where the death occurs. Although you could get a small shrub killed by this as well. Let's see, I'll see if I can find the chat here. And I'll drop into that, the website. You can probably remember this, www.sunoakdeath.org, the California, I think it was exactly, it's called Oak Mortality Task Force, something like that, where you can find out more information. And as far as a to-do item, well, basically buy your plants from reputable nurseries. I see there was a question, how does it move from shrub to tree? I don't know in all cases if there might be something like rain splash, that kind of thing. I have heard, though, an interesting, and I don't know if it was proven or just speculated, where the pathogen getting into, let's say, a waterway, a river or creek, and then floating downstream, and then shrubs that have their leaves in the stream pick it up that way. In fact, they use leaves to bait it out of waterways when they're testing for it. But I don't remember at the moment how shrub to tree transmission occurs. Moving to our next, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, the symptoms on the shrubs, leaf spots, leaf and twig blights I mentioned earlier. And again, these could be mistaken for other kinds of problems, but we are careful in the clinic when we're receiving host plants on the very long list of possibilities that we double check if it looks suspicious and make sure that we don't have Phytophthora. And then if that would occur, we have to send it off to a lab that's certified to do the actual determination of whether it's Phytophthora morum or not. And that activates a series, of course, of protocols. Vascular streak dieback is our second invasive of the, I'm going to call it a disease for purposes of this talk, but I'll mention why I hesitate slightly. This was the nursery of the first confirmed sample of this problem, and back in 2019, the first confirmed case in North America was actually here in North Carolina. Although it appears that it goes back much further based on good documentation of a mystery sample or mystery case in redbud going back to a South Carolina yard in 2013. And I thank Lorraine Graney from Bartlett Tree Experts for having pointed that one out. After that first find, it started showing up in other places, mainly here in the Southeast. And it's most often found in nurseries, but it has been found in some landscapes. Most of those are cases where the tree was recently transplanted from the nursery. Although we only had one case, not counting the one here on campus this year. And that was from a home landscape where the tree had been planted 3 years prior, I believe. So there's a bit of a question of how long can a tree be infected and before it starts showing symptoms. What causes this? Well, it hasn't been technically proven by the criterion we use in plant pathology called Koch's postulates, but it's associated with, and I would say presumed to be caused by, a fungus called Ceratobasidium theobromii, although some people prefer to refer to it under the name Rhizoctonia theobromii. That's a whole other discussion. We don't know very much about it. Probably spreads through spores, airborne spores. Lots of different species affected. very, very skewed toward the eastern redbud. That's where we've seen most of the problem, and on many, many cultivars, excuse me, of that. The next group that would be distant second would be your flowering dogwoods, and also a couple different maple species, the red maple and the Freeman's maple. Then a long list of other species where this has been found, just to name a few of them: Nyssa, Myrica cerifera, wax myrtle. Even the Fothergilla that Charlotte mentioned earlier today, that one, it has been found on that. Found it one time on spicebush. We found it on magnolia from a botanical garden. So there's just quite a bit of variety here. What symptoms would you see externally? It's going to be wilting, sometimes with a scorch-like marginal necrosis that could be confused for bacterial leaf scorch, and I'll mention that in a little bit, and defoliation. So these are symptoms, but they're not definitive, because you can have a lot of things that can cause a tree to, let's say, wilt or get scorch-like burn on the margins. Additionally, you'll see it flagging individual stems or branches. You may have shoots develop that have unusually small leaves that have a red or yellow color. It's an unnatural sort of color, although many varieties, of course, do have unusual leaf color, either early or late in development. But you may see this kind of shoot developing as a symptom as well, and then eventually dieback or even death of the plant. It's where we start cutting into the stems that we get a clue of what's going on. So one of the keys is a mild to severe marbling or streaking in the wood, but in areas where the cambium is alive. So you can see, for example, in this section here, the cambium is quite green, but you have the dark streaking in the wood. Redbud tends to have a lot of this. It can be harder to find, subtler in other species like the dogwoods or the maples. And there are lookalikes. So you wouldn't want to confuse this with, let's say, Bactrosphaeria canker. But that one, you're going to see the death of the cambium and a sharp transition zone there between the live and the dead, just under the bark. Bacterial leaf scorch, Canocaron redbud, and we see symptoms that would be similar. Verticillium, well, that gets more press than it really deserves. It's not that common of a problem here in North Carolina. If you're not in the mountains, I wouldn't really worry about verticillium wilt on trees. And then laurel wilt, which is one that I'll mention in the last section about a quick run through of some other invasives. Let me here see if I can actually highlight this. There is a fact sheet that Devin Bealey of the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Elizabeth Bush, they're at Virginia Tech, put together that will explain a little bit more about this disease. If you are, I'm calling it a disease again. If you're interested, type it in here. Sorry about the delay here. All right, so that one there is in the chat. Our third invasive for a close look is going to be beech leaf disease, BLD, and this one is found in these marked counties in green. This is from EdMaps, so you'll be hearing more about EdMaps later in the year here on PPP. It was first found in Ohio, and that was in 2012, and is now spread to the counties indicated, although also this map does a great injustice. We should ask the EdMaps presenter why, or if there's a reason why Canadian counties, I'm not sure if they call it counties, if they are not, or why they're not highlighted, because this is also in Ontario across Lake Erie from the original find. It is in Northern Virginia, so it's been there since June of 2021, but not yet in North Carolina. It's associated with infection by a nematode. Lidolencus crenati. It's not the Lidolencus crenati that occurs in Japan, though, so they realized it was different, and they have called it a subspecies of Mecanii. Unfortunately, we don't really know if the nematode is the only cause, because it's been found that you could have a nematode present, and not have disease. So are there some other microorganisms that are associated with it that are really needed for the disease to occur? We don't know it at this point. Fortunately, this affects only Fagus species, our native beech, also European beech, and at least one of the Asian beeches shown to be host, the other one presumed to be. So the good side is only Fagus. The bad side is that, of course, there's a lot of beech. The native range from the Silvix manual just roughly traced there. So there could be quite a bit of ecological impact here. This is mostly something that's being seen in forest situations, but it can occur in the landscape as well. The symptoms, and I just copied these from the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry site, which is a good one, since I haven't seen it myself except in a laminated sheet that someone passed around at a talk. Dark bands, excuse me, between the veins of the leaves. The leaves are cupped, deformed, shriveled, and maybe smaller than usual. They can be thick and have a leathery texture, unlike the papery texture of healthy leaves. Premature leaf drop, aborted buds leading to sparse leaf cover and a thinning canopy. And here are another couple of photographs of it. You can see on the right there, the very small leaves. And it will, when it's not actually, the nematodes are not actually in the leaves hanging out, they migrate to the buds. So that's another place we're going to have to look for them once we start having to test for this. One hint, if you are looking for it, is to look up. So seeing the leaves through with the light passing through them from the other side is an easier way to identify it. Now, you don't want to confuse this for some other things. Here's one that you might mistake, which is beech anthracnose, a fungal disease. We had an image sample come in earlier this year that appeared to be beech anthracnose. We didn't get a physical sample to actually prove it. So this can cause necrotic spots. They would tend to not be limited by the veins. In fact, here in this photo, you see they're kind of following the veins, but they can just be spots as well, or marginal burns. Another thing that is not beech leaf disease that you may see here would be yellowing or curling due to aphid feeding. We also got a photograph here, presumably of this, and it's a yellowing there, but you don't have the same banding system. You see also the banding of the light, deep green and lighter greens, as mentioned there in the Ohio text. And notice too, in this case, you've got that curling of the leaf margin. You don't see the serrated margin that you would normally see on a healthy beech leaf because it has curled under. The third thing that you might mistake for beech leaf disease would be the Erinium mites. And they do have some texture to them. They are also between the veins. Wish Matt were on so he could definitively say this, but I don't think they go all the way to the vein the way that you would see with the beech leaf disease. And I actually, this is from a submission to the clinic, but I saw this myself a couple of months ago. Went with my wife out to Cliffs of the New State Park, and there was a beech tree there, and this was likely the Erinium mites. Very, very quickly though, since it is 11:30, mention of three that you may have heard of and be thinking about in terms of invasives here. Laurel wilt, that's another fungal disease caused by Raffaella loricola. It's transmitted by the red bay ambrosia beetle, first found in Georgia in the year 2002, and has been in North Carolina since 2011. Mostly there, or I think it's exclusively in the southeast part of the state. And it's caused a high mortality in native stands of red bay. Millions of red bay have been killed by this fungus in the US. It doesn't just affect red bay though, but also sassafras, spicebush, avocado, and other members of the Lauraceae. But it would not affect some things that might be considered or called bays, rhododendron or magnolia. If it's not Lauraceae, then it's not going to be affected. So those spots that you see in Tennessee, that's almost certainly finds in sassafras and some of those other hosts rather than red bay, a coastal species. The thing to do here, of course, don't move firewood. Thousand canker disease of walnut is really very quickly. It's also fungus, also insect transmitted, but here it's curious because it's not invasive to the western part of the continent. It is native there, but somehow got into the east in the early part of this century. It was 2010. It was found in Knoxville, Tennessee, and there was one find in Haywood County. Maybe there were two finds in Haywood County, North Carolina. Gets on walnut, bitternut, but not pecan or hickory, fortunately. And the epidemic has really subsided in recent years. The population of the beetle vectors crashed, and so we haven't seen as much concern about this particular disease lately. Also, there have been trees that have actually recovered. Finally, real quickly, you may have heard or you may have seen Inga's post about the seed recall for another invasive, but this one's a virus. It's tomato brown rugose fruit virus. It affects both tomato and pepper and is a major concern for producers of those two vegetable crops. Related to tobacco mosaic virus and tomato mosaic virus, but the resistance genes in plants to those two tabamoviruses or those other tabamoviruses is not effective against this one. Mechanical and seed transmission, which is why that recall went out on the seeds that have been sent out by mail order. You would have been notified by now if you had been one of those who had purchased them. And I will leave it there.
Thank you so much, Mike. And yeah, today we just have so much information to share. We're moving right along, and we appreciate everything that Matt recorded and everything you prepared today, Mike. All right. To round us out, I am just going to give us a featured resource spotlight. So this is something that we started this year. We feature a resource that might help you with something that was presented on the program, or maybe that will just be a tool for your Master Gardener toolbox. Okay, slides to advance here. There we go. All right, so the resource spotlight I wanted to feature today to start off with is the Invasive Plants Council, the North Carolina Invasive Plants Council. And this is actually a nonprofit organization that's membership based. And their goal is really to be and have an organized structure for invasive plant awareness, the detection, the management. And what I thought that was neat was that members include public gardens, conservation organizations, governments, even the nursery and landscape industry. So there are a lot of contributors to this process, and that is encouraging as we all try to tackle these things together. So this website divides North Carolina into 3 regions that we are very familiar with, of course. And that's really why I liked this and thought this was a good tool for Master Gardener volunteers, because you can hone right in on the area that you're looking at, the area that you're in and advising people about. So say we looked at the mountains as our example and chose that. What it will do is it's going to give you a list of invasive plants found in this region. Here I just grabbed the trees and the vines, but when you're on the website, you'll see that it contains also shrubs, herbaceous plants, and aquatic plants, all the things that Charlotte included today. And I want to just give one example to show you what's in here. So say I was looking at what I thought was the princess tree or Polinia, and I click on that, and it's going to take me to a plant profile with good photographs. So this could confirm, yeah, this is what I think it is, and it's going to give you a brief description. So it's a quick way to confirm what you're looking at. And then if you go down here to the bottom and you click on this part, it's going to give you a fact sheet. So they have got great fact sheets, which are PDF. So that's easy to share with someone through email or print it if you'd like to. So I really liked how easy it was to find things in your region, quickly get a brief description, and then write to a fact sheet. So I encourage you to look into them. Not only does the fact sheet give you a description, but way down the bottom of the fact sheet, you scroll all the way down, you'll get some suggested alternative plants. So it's really good resource for us. And finally, what I liked is on the main list of their invasive plants, they've started to integrate this symbol, this little leaf with a slash through it. And this symbol indicates if this plant is also classified as a noxious weed in North Carolina, according to North Carolina Department of something, EQ. Environmental quality, don't quote me on that one. So what's nice is this symbol is now listed on this. So you can see, wow, this particular plant is both considered invasive and a noxious weed. Okay. And speaking of noxious weeds, part of the resource spotlight today I wanted to show you was the fact that back in 2019 in July, we had a presentation by Bridget Lassiter, who at that time was the NCDA weed specialist. She's now moved into a different position with NC State, and Jared Driscoll is now in that position. But she did a presentation for us in July 2019 on plants, pests, and pathogens related to noxious weeds. So I'm going to be sending you the link to all of these things, of course, but that's something to refer back to and look at her definition of noxious weeds and sort of refresh your memory on that. All right. Well, there is more to come on this in September. When we planned out plants, pests, and pathogens for the year, we were able to secure this speaker, Chuck Bargeron, who is with the Center for Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health. That's at the University of Georgia. Well, he works with this EdMaps system. Mike put several of the maps up on his slides today, and it helps track invasive species. It's interactive, and he's going to explain to us how we can utilize those tools and contribute to the information that they hold. So we'll look for that presentation in September on this plants, pests, and pathogens. And now we will round it out with just a few Master Gardener program announcements for this month. All right, so the first is that the Great Southeast Pollinator Census is coming up in August. Many of you might have tuned in earlier this month in June when there was a webinar about how to participate. Well, if you missed that, no worries, because now that webinar recording is posted. So you can refer to that, and also wanted to let you know that we have decided to make this a statewide EMG volunteer opportunity. So you can receive volunteer credit hours for participating in this. There's now a page on the EMG intranet that explains how to participate. Basically, they're having folks on either August 18th or 19th. Look at a plant in your garden and make note of the number and the type of pollinators that visit that plant over a period of time. So it's all spelled out for you on our page on the EMG intranet, and also their website, ggapc.org, has been updated, and it's got a lot of great resources in terms of how to participate, what's it all about, and even resources to refresh our memories on how to identify some of the pollinators that we might see coming by in our gardens. So we encourage you to sign up if you'd like to participate. You can do either of those days. You can do both of those days. It's an opportunity you can do at any time of day that's convenient for you. All right. Speaking of spotted lanternfly, earlier this year, there was a summit relating to spotted lanternfly, and there is a whole bunch of recordings that are now available. This was posted by the Northeastern IPM Center. And those recordings are now available. I wanted to make you aware of them. They're on their YouTube channel. And these presentations go into the current research on spotted lanternfly, including possible control measures that are being tested. So check those out. The Northeastern IPM Center also has an interactive map talking about where spotted lanternfly is now. And the last I checked this map, the sightings had reported 16 or so counties in North Carolina. So take a look at that. Oops, excuse me. All right, this is always an exciting time of year, and that is because coming up in August on Plants, Pests, and Pathogens, this is the time of year that we invite you to submit your photographs of pest or disease issues that you might be seeing in your garden or in a demonstration garden that you help manage. Submitting those photographs to Matt and Mike, who will take a look at them and help us understand what we are seeing. So it's already late June. It's time to get those photographs and go ahead and send them in. So we've created for you, just like we have in the past, a photo submission form. The links to all of this will be in the resources. And this is actually a Google form on which you will submit your photographs along with a little description of where you saw it and what plant and some details to help Matt and Mike with diagnosis. Something important to remember about this is that you do need to have a Google account to be able to submit photographs. And Google accounts are free and very easy to set up. So if you don't have a Google account, if you have a Gmail email address, you have a Google account. But if you don't, it's easy to set it up. And that's the way that you can upload your photographs. So take a look at that. There's a page all about it on the EMG Intranet to answer your questions. And we do ask you to get busy on this in the month of July and get your photographs in by Tuesday, August 8th. That gives Matt and Mike a couple of weeks to look through them and prepare their presentation for us at the August Plants, Pests, and Pathogens. All right, coming up, we have some plant identification classes. The instructor-led courses are beginning soon. You can see several begin in July. So take a look at those if you're interested in beginning one of those courses. Similarly, these are the instructor-led garden and landscape courses being taught by Dr. George Place. So those are also beginning. You can see the next one coming up is landscape design, and it's beginning on July 17th. We are now at the end of our announcements, and we get to look forward to next month's presentation. And it will be a guest speaker. We will have Denise Pure. She is a malacology expert, or an expert in snails and slugs from the Shield Museum here in Gastonia. So she has been working with this museum for years and focuses on the snails of the southern Piedmont. And that includes Gastonia and the surrounding regions. And she helps provide a more accurate inventory of the slugs and snails in the region. And she's going to help us understand, what's the role of slugs and snail in our gardens? Are they damaging the plants? And are there any that are actually beneficial? So she'll take us into the world of slugs and snails, and we'll learn to recognize different types, a little bit about their biology. And we'll also discuss less toxic ways to control the damage from invasive slugs. All right, that brings us to the end. We thank you for joining us today for a jam-packed episode, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thanks again. Thank you, Mike, for being with us today, and we thank Charlotte for your great presentation this morning.
Have a great month, everybody.
Yes, thank you for wrapping us up, Caroline. Hope everybody has a great July.